All right, thank you for the introduction and the opportunity to come speak at BIF. I remember as a student sitting in the audience, well, this was one of my favorite meetings to come to because of the diversity of the audience. I'm not sure of another meeting where you get research and students and breeders that ultimately can implement some of the things that come up at the meeting in a way at any other meeting. The other thing I'm super excited about is I am talking to a room of people that I can see your face. I don't know that I have ever enjoyed the opportunity to see a crowd more than this morning, even though some of you I know will heckle me later. But no disrespect to those of you on Zoom, we welcome you as well. And some of us have enjoyed the opportunity to not travel to meetings and to take in a lot of information. So we've learned a lot. So my goal today is to talk about the opportunities that precision livestock farming offers the beef cattle industry. And I start with this picture to kind of give you a direction of where I'm heading. And then I'm not going to talk a whole lot about very specific technology solutions, but more challenges to think about how we evaluate technologies, challenges to think about how we can implement technologies and really give you some rails to think about how they might work in your operation. And I use this picture as a reminder to me that we operate in a very extensive environment with a diverse set of environmental circumstances as well as labor and cattle as well. So with this, if you know me very well, you know that I oftentimes say, hey, context is important. And so a bit of background as to how we think about technology, I think is relevant. My introduction would make you think, what does this guy have to do to say about technology to start with? And so I work with a group of amazing people that provide a technology solution to cattle feeders across the world. We integrate data on the feed, financial, and health side for about 2,200 plus operations across the world. And every morning we feed about 3.5 million head of cattle. And there are several customers in the room who are likely turning off, listening to me and checking to make sure that the feed is getting delivered as it should be, because they can pull it up on their phone while they're here this morning. And so I think about technology as it relates to how those customers ultimately can integrate some of these solutions in their operations. So that's the perspective I'm going to come from. So as we think about some background information around precision livestock farming, you may have heard the term PLF or precision agriculture. If you're a row crop business, you think, precision agriculture has been around for a long time, right? Many of you are operating multiple peripherals in the cab of the tractor and only really turn around on the inrows, right? That we can get down to sub-acre, sub-foot precision in the agronomic space. PLF in the livestock space is there's kind of two avenues as to how it's described. The first one is the one that you see here is the application of process engineering to an animal. And so what that means is effectively you are constantly monitoring that animal for deviations from normal, right? And so this diagram shows the two red lines as that's the range of acceptability. And that animal can deviate within that range. And once it goes outside of spec, that is when you have this deviation, right? And so for those of you who have connected machines, right, that's when your implement dealer says, hey, you need to get that tractor in here. That's how they know they are doing that type of process. And so we see that type of technology used to detect calving when an animal is going to calve. We see, many of you may have used the technology to detect estrus, where you see increased activity in an animal and knows she's coming into estrus soon. We see lameness detection in the dairy industry using pedometers when they walk differently or take different steps. And we also see technologies that we'll maybe hear about some this afternoon that detects illness because an animal's temperature has varied or their feeding pattern has varied. And so that approach to PLF, or precision livestock farming, I will refer to as diagnostic, right? It is very singular in its nature. It is singular in its event, but it is a diagnostic, future-looking preventative, right? I need to diagnose a binary event. That is not all that novel for some of us, right? In that detecting the absence of normal is how many of us walk out into a pasture and evaluate whether a heifer is going to calve or whether an animal is going to get sick. A good veterinary friend of mine says that is the best way to train someone. I can't teach them every disease, but I can teach them what normal looks like, right? And I know what normal deviation looks like. If you've heard me tell the story, the automatic water might have done more detriment to animal health than anything, because I looked at a lot more cattle waiting on the water to fill up than I do today, knowing that it's already there. And so this finding deviations is enabled from a precision standpoint, because as we get more and more animals together, it's harder to put eyes on all of them, right? And so we use sensor-based technologies to do these diagnostics, because we can use the sensor to detect those deviations from normal. There's another aspect of precision livestock farming that is of interest to this group, and that is the massive collection of phenotype data in a passive manner, right? One of the challenges we think about from a genetic improvement standpoint is continuing to get you all to submit phenotype data, because it has to inform the genetic predictions down the road. And so precision livestock farming offers the opportunity to take information, whether that's through a sensor, whether that's through daily feeding, whether that's how the cattle are managed at the chute, gather all of that information, move it to the cloud, and digitize it, right? And so PLF digitizing data and allowing that management data to be moved is one of the real opportunities that we see from a technology standpoint. It also offers the opportunity to accomplish the goal that Dr. Thompson talked about and Mike talked about yesterday, is that movement of the story from one segment to the next, right? And we'll talk a bit more about that later as an opportunity. As we think about precision livestock farming, one of the things you can think about it is ultimately it's predictive, right? It provides you the opportunity to make management decisions that are predictive of outcomes. And so we're going to take genetic potential, we're going to take sensors from the environment, we're going to take actual practices, and we're going to predict when that animal is going to be finished or when it is going to be optimum in its marketing. That is not novel to this group, right? Some of you are saying, Justin, we've had EPDs for years and we can predict the genetic potential. That's the reason that we're here. What PLF offers is the opportunity to integrate those predictions, right? Each of us, to some extent, operate within a vacuum of our own operation, right? Like we know a lot about the genetics, or we know a lot about the management, but each of those squares that I have represented, whether it's genetic potential, whether it's a sensor that's detecting how the animal's moving about, whether it's the information from the veterinary processing crew, the environment, or how the animal's fed, up until today, we don't see a lot of connectivity between those photographs, right? And that is the reason that PLF offers us some opportunity going forward, is because now I get an entire snapshot of that animal in real time because the data is connected. It's no longer trying to piece those things together. And so overall, that's really our opportunity, is to make that animal more productive because I know more about all of the factors that are influencing it. And so we'll talk about the application of that in a minute. But our goal, right, in terms of any of our goals really here, is to produce more high quality beef with less resources, using the restricted labor resources that we have on farm, right? I mean, that is the goal, regardless of the technology that we're talking about. In reality, most people would suggest the fastest way to sustainability and to accomplish that goal is to do what? Get bigger. Fair to say, right? Like scale is ultimately the easiest way to drive out inefficiencies in an operation. I take out the production efficiencies, the less number of people or animals that are involved, and the bigger the singular operation is, I can windrow the management and make the best decisions because I'm bigger, right? And so As operations scale, they use technology to address the challenge of fewer people and higher number of animals. And so I go back to this slide and say there's a lot of precision livestock farming that has been going on in other industries, right? If you think about the other industries that have scaled from conception to harvest, the swine, the poultry industries predominantly, they have a number of sensors that they are using to monitor barns, manage large flocks of birds, large herds of pigs, in a way that allows them to be more efficient. And so many, if you read in the popular press, they will say beef is lagging behind because they have not integrated these technologies. But largely it has come because we are very segmented and we still do a good job of managing our individual segments. The dairy industry has adopted a lot of PLF technology as they have increased in size. And the other thing that's consistent with the adoption of PLF that I've described, where are all of those animals housed? In some pretty significant confinement, right? Like sensors are pretty easy to deploy when it's being deployed through a barn. When we turn them out on a section of ground or government pasture, now those sensor opportunities begin to get a bit harder to deploy. And so that's where we'll talk about some of the opportunities going forward. Okay, so scale, it would be terrible if you walk away and say, Justin said, just get bigger and that's the way to sustainability, right? That's not my goal. And in that, a great paper from Dr. Berkman's that talked about the greatest path to sustainability and efficient resource use is to optimize the genetic potential of an animal. And I thought, wow, there's an anchor slide, Dan, that I can get behind at BIF and talk about, right? So if we think about the path to sustainability and to address the consumers concerned around sustainability, as Michael talked about yesterday, like how do we even define that, right? Is if I'm going to optimize the genetic potential as a path to sustainability, how can I use technology to do that? Because if you ask a consumer, they would be a lot happier with smaller operations that are optimizing potential than one big one, right? Fair to say? Okay, so if we think about this path, we're at a point in the meeting where the coffee is starting to wear off. You're starting to wonder what's going on at home. And suddenly it's like, Justin's not as interesting as I thought he was going to be. And so, all right, so this is the active process, and I'm going old school because I was afraid that the voting wouldn't work, right? So here's the question. I want you to estimate, so start thinking about the question, the percentage of genetic potential that is captured on the average animal that walks off your place. Okay, so each of you breed animals, produce beef, some of you in various segments, but on your place, what percentage of the total genetic potential from birth is captured at harvest? Okay, that's the question. Now, the active part of this question is you're going to raise your hand. You're going to leave it up when I get to a point where you no longer think it's applicable. All right, so I'm going to start, we're going to scale up, and then we're going to get to 100% where you think it's all captured. All right, that way you have to move and you have to put your phone down, or you at least have to do it one-handed, right? So here it is. I'm going to start at 50%. How many think 50% of every animal's genetic potential is captured? Raise your hand. I either started too high or you're not that interested in the question. Okay, so there's not very many people that would suggest we're even 50% efficient. Okay, so I'm going to back down. How many would say 25? A few more. Does that bother anyone at all? The idea that we have an entire organization. So does anybody think it's above 90? Hands up. Okay, if you think about all of the goals towards sustainability and the opportunity to enhance the production of beef, less than 20% of the crowd raised their hand and said, we captured 40% or higher of the genetic potential of an animal. And so that is the challenge from a technology standpoint. And there's a number of technologies that we should be able to enhance that, right? And is the idea that All we have to do is feed what we actually produce from a potential standpoint. Okay, so I think I would have anticipated, I kind of thought we would get to 60, so you guys are a little more pessimistic than me. But if we think about how this actually happens in practice, a couple of questions around technology. I'm a pretty simple guy when it comes to technology and think about how can we do this. My question is, if you think about the beef production system, as you move further down the line, do we optimize the animal for genetic potential, or do we optimize to the size of the truck that hauls them across the country? Right? If you think about the average feed yard pen, it is designed based off of the number of the cattle come in and how those cattle are going to go out. Does it have any design around it that optimizes how those animals are going to perform? I would suggest no. Right? And so some high-level technology, more fence. Right? That is an opportunity that I think we have. It doesn't maybe necessarily have to be fence, but what technologies allow us to put virtual fence to some extent within the feed yard from a management perspective. Right? So I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. But our goal with PLF is to take that individual animal in a pen environment and manage to him. Right? That is ultimately the goal. How do I apply a management to an individual animal in a pen environment? Because at the end of the day, we can't have that small of pens, right? We still have to have some operational efficiency because labor is going down. Okay, and so this was really an interesting read for me. We talk about we manage animals to the average, right? And our goal is to manage the average, but Dr. Rosa talked, she coined the phrase, or I thought super interesting, is that individuals are penalized within a pen, right? And so the reason I thought somebody would say maybe 60 was, in my mind, right, half of the animals are overmanaged because they have below average genetic potential, and the other half are undermanaged to their genetic potential because we're feeding to the mean, right? We manage to the mean. In reality, by rule of math, half of us are above it and half of us are below it. And in reality, in this pen of cattle, there's not really that many of them that represent the actual average, some semblance of it, right? There's a distribution. But as we think about how we can use PLF, is how do we stop that penalization of animals with high genetic potential? And so I'm not to say that we don't want any variation, right? So this is probably the wrong group to say, eliminate variation, we want all uniformity, because all of the seed stock breeders in the room exploit variation, right? Like you seek variation to make genetic improvement, right? And so that variation is very much needed. But as we move down the supply chain, managing that variation comes at a cost. Right? And it is that penalization of a group where we are trying to minimize that variation, but we market cattle on the average, right? How many commercial cow-calf operations are able to sort their calves into the great ones, the average ones, and the ones somebody else can have, right? That is really hard in a marketing system. And in a feed yard, they take what the stocker segment does and consolidates variation. But still, if you think about the average feed yard pen, there's probably 20 herds in a large commercial feed yard pen from a procurement standpoint. So we are managing big groups in a way that we can't optimize individual animal performance. So some would say, Justin, we need to know more about the requirements of the cattle. That's where the technology is going to help us do a better job. I would argue we know about as much about the requirements and how to manage the cattle as we need. Right? If you think about it today, you all would say we're 40% successful at exercising the performance of the cattle. We know a lot about their genomics. We know a lot about their curve in terms of growth. We also know that what we do at the chute and how it influences those cattle. We may know how they perform off of grass. We may actually know their carcass information. The knowledge around it is not the problem. Right? And I use this as an example of where the knowledge around the estrus cycle wasn't the problem. The adoption of genetic improvement and how genetic improvement could be made was never the problem. It was executing it in mass, right? And that once we had reproductive technologies developed where we could work groups of cattle and apply individual genetics, AI implementation has increased significantly, right? That's a success because the barrier to technology is not, or the barrier technology can solve is not more knowledge, it's execution of what we already know, right? And so I have two challenges for you to think about relative to technology. The first one is that if we're going to apply technology to do a better job of conveying the genetic potential of an animal, or anything else about the animal for that matter, is that information has got to be relevant for the segment that's gathering it, right? So what that means is that you as a cow-calf producer, we would love for you to pass on information down the chain. Let's say we want to talk about how the cattle were raised because the consumer's interested in that. That's not relevant information for you. It's relevant for this segment, right? But if it's not relevant for you, you're not going to pass it on. And so we have to make technology that adopts and gathers that data that's relevant to everybody in a passive way. You don't want to have to gather it. It just happens, right? The next one is the segment that's responsible for transfer has to be willing to transfer it, right? And so if we think about how cattle move across the US, there's a segment that may or may not be interested in information transferring across those segments, right? And that's not casting a stone. That's the reality of the information we give them is not useful to the next segment, or in their perception, it isn't. So the first solution that technology solves for is it makes the information useful or easily transferred without it being useful. It just happens. You gather the data, it moves in a way that you don't have to do additional input. The next one is that data needs to arrive at the next place in a useful format in a timely manner. Okay, so here's what I want you to think about. From birth to harvest, we're going to leave this managing an individual in a pen out. We're going to talk only about managing an individual itself. From birth to harvest, how many times do you have to influence that animal when it's right in front of you? If you think about from the time it's born till the time it's harvested, when you have him captive in a chute and you can deploy technology to do something, how many times do we have to influence him? It's not very many, depending on your segment all the way through. You say birth, weaning, arrival at the stocker operation, revac at the stocker operation, arrival at the feed yard, maybe reimplant. Let's say it's 6, okay? Some of that data would be really useful, but if it doesn't get to the processing crew before they get done, that genetic potential that you worked hard to convey doesn't do a lot of good because I can't implement anything on it, right? So technology solves those two things. It solves data transfer and it solves data timeliness. Okay, so one of the things I'm going to do, kind of shift gears a little bit, is to talk about some things I want you to think about when you evaluate technology, right? And so when I look at a technology that we potentially integrate with, these are the kind of the big things that I think about, like, okay, how, if we integrate with this, does it help and provide a mechanism to be successful? And the first one is you'll see that onboard computing is important. So what that means is that the algorithms or the math or the computations are occurring on the sensor itself, as opposed to shoving all of that data to the cloud and then being computed. That's what that means, right? So if you get the opportunity to have a conversation with the technology provider, the opportunity that they're doing the computations at the animal level or pasture level where that doesn't have to be moved to the cloud, you all know what kind of connectivity you have in some parts of your operation, right? We think about it as if you can send a text there, the data should be able to flow, right? That's how much bandwidth you should need. The next one is it should be able to operate offline, right? Like the technology solutions that you look at should be operational offline, and when you get back to connectivity in some form or fashion, the data moves, right? This is kind of my checklist if I'm you as I evaluate opportunities from a technology standpoint in PLF. The next one is the ability to upgrade and scale. And that's a hard question to get an answer to, but it's the most important one, right? How many of you have a system in your operation right now that you have a love-hate relationship with because, like, you have a whole lot of data invested, but the cost of switching is really high, And so the ability to upgrade and update and scale a technology solution is operationally critical, because data entry is painful for everyone, right? The next one, this came up last night, is the idea that it is a passive model versus an active model. And so passive models do not require this secondary battery, or they kind of address some of this secondary battery. And passive sensors don't always solve all the problems. But at the end of the day, one of the greatest limitations to technology in the real estate that is the ear of the beef animal is a battery. And batteries are going to continue to get better over time. But today, if you think about where we have solutions on the technology side, it's a solution that works as long as the battery does. And that's why you see it work for calving. That's why you see it work for estrus detection. Those are short-term solutions. And so these, again, are just kind of questions to ask about as you evaluate technology. The last one is peripheral agnostic, and that's like big words that effectively says it works with everything, right? And that when you evaluate a technology, can the wand, the stick, the reader, the sensor work with your other devices, right? What that effectively means is you think about an iPhone, it works with nearly everything, right? There's two camps, there's the iPhone and the Android. And if regardless of camp you're in, they don't always work with everything. So overcome those type of barriers, or you evaluate technology. So those are the keys to consideration. These two issues are more how I think about it from an industry perspective. These are the industry issues we're going to have to think about, right? And that as we hear about telling the story and doing the right thing, the picture on the left is the consumer's view of beef production. There's a red barn. It's a pastoral setting. The cattle are grazing at free will and everything is great, right? If we think about the opportunity to utilize technology to address some of the biggest problems we have with labor, it might look more like the Matrix, right? That's how we start to make a transition where we have robots driving cattle at the packing plant. And so we have to find a balance where technology solves problems, but the consumer at the same time is saying, I don't know, is the machines managing the cattle or is it the people? Right? And so as an industry, we will have to continue to monitor what becomes acceptable practice from a management, autonomous management, versus what we know as normal management today. And then the next one that I think will probably be the one that you all will face the soonest is ultimately the data privacy issue. As you think about technology and precision livestock, is the opportunity that the data that you have has value, and how that data is being used up and down the supply chain has to offer you some value to transfer it, but at the same time, some autonomous ability to operate, right? And so in the crop side, there is a lot of data that's utilized to make management decisions, a lot of data that's utilized to do advantage pricing and those type of things. And that's where the producers have arguably said, this data is monetized in this way, right? That same issue will come up as we move forward with precision livestock technologies in the livestock space as well. So just kind of to wrap it up, a quick summary here is, as we think about technology solutions that'll work in the beef industry, they'll do a couple of things. They'll solve that information transfer segment, because arguably we have a really good handle on value addition in this industry, right? What we have to worry about is value capture. And PLF will provide an opportunity to move from 40% of genetic potential captured to something higher than that. There's going to be a number of ways that it can happen, but at the end of the day, I think the greatest opportunity is the conveyance of information and potential to the next segment so they can act on it in a meaningful way. And that meaningful way actually came up in the video this morning, but I'm going to first read a quote from Daniel Kahneman, because it may be too small for some of you to see. I know my poor eyes, it would be. Okay, so this is his quote. I think changing behavior is extremely difficult. Anybody who's very optimistic about changing behavior is just deluded. It's hard to change other people's behavior. It's very hard to change your own. Okay, so you're like, Justin, why did you even talk if you're going to read that thing? I'm not going to change anything I do, right? But I think the thing that the reason I like that quote is it goes back to what was said in the video this morning. What did they say? We keep feeding just like we had been, right? As we evaluate technology solutions, you should not change your behavior in a much of a significant way. Because if you have to change your behavior, suddenly it becomes too much trouble to make the change. So as you evaluate technology solutions, it should be in your normal daily workflow, right? It should capture data that has value to the end user that flows without you doing anything other than what you love, managing cattle, right? That is ultimately one of the ways that we'll see mass adoption of technology is it happens in your normal life, right? Like how many of you have your phone with you today because you cannot imagine life without it, right? Like everyone in the room. And the reason is because that's become normal daily workflow, right? How many of you get an instruction manual for an app that's on your phone? How many of you have read an instruction manual for your app? How many of you even read the instruction manual for your phone? Maybe you hand it to your grandkids or my kids like I do, right? But the reality of it is so intuitive, you don't need an instruction manual. If you have a technology solution that comes with an instruction manual, it's causing behavior change because you have to read about it. And so that from a technology opportunity comes where look for opportunities that address this labor issue, but don't require an instruction manual, right? I boiled it down to that, Dan. You don't need an instruction manual. The one thing PLF really offers us, I think in a grand way, is we talk a lot about the challenges of labor. And the idea that we're going to use machines or robots to eliminate labor is, I mean, there's some opportunities there, but the reality of it is it gives us the opportunity to change the skill needed of the labor, right? And that is probably what I would suggest most of you would tell me, Justin, I have trouble finding skilled labor, not labor. And so PLF offers us the opportunity to wrangle some of those skills that we can develop over time, but we don't have when they first come in. And so again, PLF is it is producing more animals with less or more product with less resources. But really, I think as you look at solutions that provide you value, if it doesn't provide you value immediately on the farm, it should sure offer value to the next segment in a way they can act on it. And that is really the take-home message is how do we move this information throughout the food and supply chain in a way that people can make decisions. The cloud and technology gives us the opportunity to move the information. It's whether we actually take the time to act on it. So with that, I appreciate the opportunity to come visit.
Thank you for a great talk. One of the things that you just briefly mentioned was the ability to control our data, the privacy of it, the value of it. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so it's an issue we think about a lot. And so if you think, so I'm going to use a couple of examples, right, from other industries, and then I'll come back to ours and appreciate the question. Is the value of data, if you think about it today, we exchange data in a number of ways we may or may not know about, right? And so one of the ones that's most interesting to me is some of you can get car insurance if you download this app to your phone that will give you a discount, right? And so somewhere in that end user license agreement, you said, I am going to knowingly tell you when I speed, take curves too fast, and stop suddenly for $20 a month off my car insurance, right? And so that's kind of an extreme example, but that's effectively what you have done, right? I have traded my data for a value proposition here. And so what we think about is ultimately the aggregate data provides an opportunity to say, we know a lot about how the big general population is managed, but I don't want to drill down into the individual identifying data, right? So the individual identifying data in most data management agreements comes down to that's yours, you're not individually identified. The aggregate data is used to make better decisions across the entirety of a platform. That's how a lot of the crop things work. And so the thing that you will get to as a user, right? How many of you have agreed to the Apple terms of service? That's a data use agreement where it says, I'm giving you every insight that comes through this phone in exchange for something that works super well, right? And so I think how you all view data management and data use agreements comes down to what are you willing to trade, right? And so today you trade data with breed associations and others because the predictions you get back are worthwhile, right? That's the same data exchange. I just bring it up as an industry. It's one of those things that you'll continue to see people saying, well, data privacy is an issue, right? That the issue is going to be, do you see value in exchange for the data? It's not so much how it's going to be defined, it's whether you see value from that exchange. Great question.
Justin, as seed stock producers, you obviously are looking at a lot of different sensor technology. What would you say are 2 or 3 of those that we ought to be thinking about as seed stock producers to implement to start collecting phenotypic data?
Yeah, so great question. I think to me, there's a couple of things from a sensor standpoint. The behavior, any of the sensors that can look at some form of behavior, right? And I'm not even going to define that, but monitors animal movement, number of times maybe an animal comes to the bunk, number of times they go to the water, how long they stay at the water, those type of behavioral sensors that can monitor key implementations of feed, of water, of how long they stay in the shade or are inactive, provide you the greatest wealth of information, Lee, from a standpoint of, we don't even know how some of that data would be used. But if you know about how an animal behaves normally, and then you identify that animal as a high production animal or a low feed intake animal, now you can start to use the machines to go backwards into that behavior data and say, okay, this is the behavior pattern that has value. And so I would tell you the sensors that provide you the opportunity to get at behavior data in a way that still allows you to implement normal management, right? Some of those things are really hard to implement. They're short term in terms of how they capture data. They have value. Just the reality of it is a long-term sensor that can get through a feeding period, or at least an initial portion of a feeding period, to look at some of the sickness behaviors has the most opportunity the way we see it. Great question.